software, and and you see what comes out of that. There's a lot of really appalling embedded software for consumer devices, and that's just kind of the reality. And in many cases, they can't even afford to do much better. They might like to, but building good software is expensive. We spend a lot of money at id Software employing a lot of talented programmers to write good software, and not everybody has that opportunity. But when I look at some of these things that kind of pique my fancy, like a head-mounted display or something, I look at that and say, well, if somebody really took all of these pieces, they pulled them all apart, and they built the software and hardware stack as a unit, as a kind of a synergistic whole rather than bolting things together, then you probably could get to that magic moment where all of a sudden it does feel like the goggles into the virtual world there. But that's a hard sell to make. These are not mass market items. They don't have big budgets to be able to, put a team of a dozen software developers writing something that, that may or may not. It's a guess. Would it be really the next big thing if you could wind up doing that? But I'm so tempted to want to almost undertake some of that myself, because I think that it would be, that may be one of those things where we've had the magic moments in gaming where, where we see something just really was special. I can remember the first time, I had my fingers on the keyboard over here on Doom multiplayer, and I saw like a guy moving around to the screen on the other monitor, and I was like, okay, this is a magic piece. This is something that's going to be really important. And I think there are more things like that with I/O devices that are yet to come. And it's not clear where that level is. Is getting it down to, to 15 milliseconds, is that good enough? There are some optical phenomena that happen at microsecond levels, although I don't think those are actually all that important. Your eye will sometimes do these darting moves that happen at incredibly fast time scales. But I do think that one of the keys might be, it would only be good software engineering to get all the latencies that we don't need out of the existing things. There is just waste there that should be fixed. But it may be better, or it may be necessary to go another way and decouple the presentation of the current view from the whole software loop. Because again, right now it goes through a lot of stuff. You've got sensors, filtering, transport over the USB, the app reads it, the app starts doing something, it goes through its multi-frame pipeline of figuring out where it's going to do things, the renderer gets it, the GPU gets it, and finally it goes out of video port and gets buffered someplace else before it's finally shown. An experiment I would love to see done is to, instead of having the game render just the view that you see in there, have the game render a bigger view, which is actually would happen almost automatically, because most of these things have very narrow fields of view, and if you render a 70 or 90 degree field of view, you've got a lot of extra image space there. So buffer that, and then have actually the device go ahead and move that image around at sub-millisecond level on there, where I suspect that you would be fine even with just 2D panning. But even if you wound up treating it as a cube map and rotating it around there, it's doable. That's totally doable with today's hardware. Even if you just did it with the one frame latency, where you figure out your local next frame before the next frame, there's no question that that's doable. But it might be something that you even wind up doing on a scanline basis. So you're actually getting things that are in subframe latencies coming across here. And I think at some point you wind up hitting that magic moment where it winds up being perceived as something different. And I keep looking at this, and one of these times I'm going to be in some lull in all the stuff that I'm doing, maybe, and I'll just get that urge to go ahead and it's like, okay, let's talk to hardware manufacturers directly and let's really see what can be done with this. Throw an inordinate amount of hardware at it or something, and just find that research project point of, is there a point here where you can say that this really makes a difference and we can do something really fundamentally cool with that? So but the long digressions coming around from handset manufacturers. But I think that there's the I/O devices on there where I don't have any great thoughts on input, where the big push now is all the motion sensing things, and people always ask us how we're going to wind up using that, and the truth is that if you've got a game that's finely tuned for one input device, it's not going to come out and be magically better with a different one. And it's just, there's never been an input device that I would say the mouse, the original use of the mouse, the first time when we went from just a keyboard to having a mouse on there, would have been one of those moments where a game could have been built all around keyboard and it could just be much better than with the mouse. But I don't think we've ever seen that sense where we got a game that was finely tuned for a particular interface that got much better by adding some peripheral for it. So I'm not a big booster of the current crop of motion stuff. We don't have any direct plans for doing that. But there's still something there. And I think there's great things that are going to happen from that. And it's not to say that they're without value, but they're not a lot of value to do. I would like to try building a game around something like that directly, because that's the joy of a new platform, again, to see what preconceptions do you have or what things have you always done that you don't have to do or you can do completely differently in this different world. And there are motion things like that that probably will be spectacular. We're just not going to be the people that wind up doing them in that case. But input is still one of those things. There's more to be done there, and I'm not really sure what to do there. I have a lot of thoughts on output, on what we can do on the presentation side, how we can wind up making these better, the relative qualities of that. Another thing that was great with the Rage iPhone demo, I actually hacked a lot of stuff in on that just yesterday. So I'm like, okay, QuakeCon's tomorrow. I've got it kind of working, but I'm not going to work on any Rage stuff. Let's just turn on all of these relative things. So I was going through, tweaking through back to back of, okay, here's single nip level, here's single nip level pixel selection, here's trilinear, here's anisotropic on it, here's rendering up an additional texture level. And I think at some point I'm going to go ahead and make a little dedicated app where you can just toggle through all of these things, because it was interesting looking at the trade-offs in resolution and all those features kind of coming and going on the relative values and costs, where it's always easy to say something like, this will be better, but the question is it going to be enough better that you haven't wasted the opportunity cost of what else you could be doing? And we made the big transition, this project line, to say that, well, frame rate, you've always wanted a high frame rate, but now we've said, there used to be a lot of people that would talk to high-end viz sim people, and even some of the early console people. There was a sort of snobbishness about 60 frames per second. Viz sim people, it's like, oh, unlike you games, we cannot drop a frame. We're not allowed to on this. And there is a value to that. But what a lot of these people were missing is that it has a value that you need to compare against things. And there were plenty of cases where you might have an opportunity of playing a 60 frames per second flat shaded 3D game or playing Doom. And lots of people would rather have played Doom. And that trade-off there is some people are blind to that, where you have whatever pet feature or pet theory that you've got about things, and you ascribe more value to it than it really should have. But it's always hard to really quantify these things, where sometimes now, I think, now that we're a bigger company, we can do kind of broader user survey testing things. There's something that I wish that I could spin up people like servers. The Amazon stuff is awesome in that you can just spin up hundreds of servers here. There's times when I have something I want to test. I would really love to spin up 100 users and say better or worse, to be able to kind of collect data from here. Because when you're just running through stuff yourself, especially when you develop something, there have been little subtle control things that I do on my control integration. Like, this sounds like a good idea, feels a little bit better to me, but you got to truck some people in and say, okay, bring 3 people in, try it like this. I'm like, okay, 3 people like my way. I'm going to call that a win for myself rather than testing too many more people and maybe losing out the statistics there. But there are lots of stuff with output there. One of the things in Rage that we are divided as a company about is the value of post-processing effects. And a lot of the artists and designers love it. They think that this makes things look really cinematic, and that it gives this eerie feeling. You show the screenshot, and when you do the demo of wiping the post-process around, people ooh and ah, and it's a big hit, right? But when a lot of us wind up looking at this and saying, we worked really hard to create all of these pixels and render all of these pixels, and you turn them all to mud. You do not appreciate this. And I really want to do a bunch of back-to-back comparisons where, you'd never be able to pull it off and get an accurate thing if you say turn the post on or off, because it really is too different. But if you just said better or worse, turning it on, and you'd get an interesting breakdown there, just doing better or worse, but it's too in your face. What I would love to do is take a set of levels, take like 8 levels, and for one group of people, run 4 of them with post, 4 of them without post, and for the other group, split it. And then you have them all like rank the levels relative to each other and how you thought they looked or the impression you made. And then I would really like to see the statistical distribution there. You can fairly say then, did people like this level better than this level based on the content of the post on there? I don't know if I'm going to get around to being able to run experiments like that. I'm not sure how it's going to wind up being settled internally. I am of more than half a mind to wind up a project that I want to wind up doing involving the megatexture is to go ahead and do high dynamic range megatexturing and then do a very sophisticated tone mapping across the entire thing. Because it would be static, it can't be view dependent, but I've got some good ideas for what I want to do there and where I could kind of take most of the lighting question, the lighting problem, out of some of the artists and designers' hands. Where I know we've got the sense that art is incredibly important. One of the things that I made the comment recently to some people about, where people talk about, well, why do we care about adding more graphics into games? Don't we just care about the gameplay? And yes, of course we care about the gameplay, but it's worth remembering that people go to museums to see art that doesn't even move. There's no interactivity. Art on its own sake has value. Making things that are beautiful is important. It's an important aspect here to kind of convey this sense of awe and just see the wonderfully cool stuff. And as much as people might kind of gripe about it in the industry, it's still the case that looking incredible is really, really important. So the artistic sense is a big deal. But I took to heart a lot of we got dinged really bad with Doom 3 about the game being too dark. And I totally believe that was justified and true. And that was a large chunk of the design that, okay, Rage, we're going to have outside in deserts, and it's going to be bright, and people will be able to see what we make on this. And I know how these things come about, where some of it is environmental. If you visit id, the lights are all off everywhere, the windows are all shuttered, and everyone's staring straight at the screens. It's like, okay, you build that lighting environment. It's not going to look right in someone's living room when they're playing it on their big screen TV with their windows open. That's sort of a design question that we still don't have a great solution for. What do we do? The artists hiss at us if we turn on lights. But some of it has actually been technical. Like, one of the problems is that the range of lighting by default in Doom and Rage now has been that you put a light in and it's got this intensity of 1, and it's got a fall off, and it's got a projection, and it's got an incident angle, and all of these things wind up going lower and lower and lower and lower. Early on in Doom 3, I found I had to multiply this by at least 2 to get it up to something at all legible. In hindsight, I wish that I had multiplied it by 4, because then people are comfortable, designers are comfortable turning down the lights. But very, very rarely do they wind up increasing the lights. They work, you can put lighting values at 10, but just in truth, it rarely happens. They will dial around on the color picker, but it's not intuitive or obvious to go ahead and throw more light into it. So that was one of those things that technically should have been done a little bit differently, and we still suffer for that in Rage because the same basic equations and light projections are there. The iPhone map, when I was doing this, looking at it on an iPhone in a typical session, it's like, this is way, way too dark. So I went in, I brightened the entire thing up by a factor of 2. Hey, this looks better. Let's brighten it up by a factor of 3. Hey, it looks better still. I think there's some of this that we need to apply across the rest of our game. And in the iPhone map there were a few places that were blown out, that were oversaturated, but it was better than when it was when you couldn't really see things. We went through the exact same thing on the iPhone with Doom Resurrection, where that was using some Doom 3 media on there, and using dot 3 lighting, and the same type of thing. It gets darker and darker and darker. And it was too damn dark. That was